Hey, hi everyone, and welcome to this, our third big topic talk in our online event series. I am Ed Green and I'm a Senior Development Manager at Grosvenor. And welcome back to all the people who joined us last week, and a warm hello to everyone who is joining us for the first time today. Today we're going to be speaking about spectacular horticulture and biodiversity, and how do we create places that boom and beckon biodiversity. We're so grateful that you've taken the time to join us today, and I really hope that you enjoyed the session. So this event is part of the engagement programme that we're conducting as we consider redesigning Grosvenor Square. The square recently returned to Grosvenor's control, and we're looking at ways to invest in it to make it more suited for the demands on an urban green space in the 21st century. We think there are lessons that can be learned from this process for other green spaces. So today we want to think about urban green spaces on a London scale, and then think specifically about Grosvenor Square as well. So I'm so thrilled to introduce four amazing speakers who are going to help us with just that today. First, we're going to hear from Ed Ikin. Ed is the head of landscape, horticulture and research at Wakehurst, Kew's Wild Botanic Garden. Ed was previously chair of the London Parks and Gardens Trust, general manager of Morden Hall Park in South West London, assistant head gardener of the Chelsea Garden, and head gardener at Nyman's, which is National Trust. Ed is a Claw Fellow, holds an RHS Masters of Horticulture and an MA in Garden History. So it's fair to say he knows a lot about gardens. Then we're going to hear from Nigel Dunnett. So Nigel is a professor of planting design and urban horticulture in the Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield, and is one of the world's leading voices on an innovative approach to planting design and public spaces. His work revolves around the integration of ecology and horticulture to achieve low input, high impact landscapes that are diverse, dynamic, and tuned to nature. And he is part of the design team for the Grosvenor Square project. Next up is Emily Morthouse. Emily manages the London Wildlife Trust's youth engagement programme, Keeping It Wild, which aims to inspire and empower hundreds of young Londoners aged 11 to 25 to take part in urban nature conservation across the capital. She's also a Green Flag award judge, and leads the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group at the Trust. Finally, Kabir Kaul. Kabir is a young conservationist, wildlife writer and passionate advocate for biodiversity and nature conservation in London. He's an RSPB youth councillor and a London National Park City champion. London National Park City is a charity that raises awareness about London's biodiversity and how Londoners can make a difference for it. So once again, we'll be helped through the next hour and a quarter or so by Kath and Greg from Make Good. Make Good are helping us facilitate the whole conversation we want to have with everyone who has an interest in the future of Grosvenor Square. So she'll be prompting some discussions with both our speakers and with you, the audience. So please do get involved, share your thoughts in the comment stream and post questions to our panel. So without further ado, over to you, Catherine.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed. So I'm excited that we're going to be discussing horticulture and biodiversity today with such a great panel. Just to give you a shape of today's session, we're going to start off with a quick question to our panel that will help us frame our discussion. Then I'd like you as audience members also to respond to that in the chat function. If you don't know where that is, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little icon with a speech bubble. If you click that, it's going to bring up the chat function on the right-hand side. So if you have any questions or thoughts, please put them in there. And we want you to answer some of the questions that the speakers are answering as we go along. Then we're going to have a quick, snappy 5-minute talks from each of the speakers, followed by a discussion where we put in questions from you to the panel. So please do pop your questions from them into the Q&A channel, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen as well. It doesn't matter if you put it in the wrong channel, don't worry, the Make Good team are on hand to pick up the questions and filter them to me, so I will be putting them to the panel. And finally, we want to end by thinking about what the learning is for Grosvenor Square, because whilst we want to think about how do we create spectacular horticulture and biodiversity across our urban squares on a city-wide scale, we also want to think specifically about what that means for Grosvenor Square. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to ask my first question of the panel and of you as audience, which is, what does spectacular horticulture mean to you? So, Ed, Ikin, I'm going to come to you first.
Hi there, Catherine. I suppose there's a couple of things that always need to balance with this principle of spectacular. I want something that makes me forget about anything else that was in my brain prior to that moment. So what is in front of me is so extraordinary, so immersive, that it's my emotions that are reacting. I'm just feeling it. I'm not thinking about it. But I suppose when the moment comes where I do start thinking about it, I want to know that what underpins it is sound. I want to know that we're perhaps using some really kind of sensible ecological principles, that we've established this thing for the long term, so I can come back and see it year after year.
What do you think?
Sorry, Catherine, I think you were on mute then. Did you say me?
I did say you, yes.
Hi. Yeah, I guess for me, it's, I guess, on the wilder side of things. So for me, what makes it spectacular is, I guess, when it's linked into the wider ecological network and providing resources that support wildlife, and when it embraces sort of non-conformity and sort of wildlife and wild space are not too manicured and perfect, but whatever shape they come in, they're sort of always uplifting.
Amazing. Kabir, what do you think?
Well, I think spectacular horticulture is a mix of things. So firstly, it should definitely attract and benefit wildlife, but it should also draw people in with colour. And at the same time, as Emily was saying, being part of the wider ecosystem, that network which connects all living things. And having this right in the heart of London is key, it's very important. And just with all this colour, it'll really fuel curiosity in all ages, especially children, because they're the future custodians of the planet, and fueling their passion and their curiosity will really benefit the future and the future of conservation, especially in London.
Yeah, amazing. Such important points that I know that both you and Emily are going to touch on, that link between, you know, I guess bringing the next generation of custodians into being interested in their outdoor spaces and wildlife. Nigel, what does spectacular horticulture mean to you?
Well, coming last, I guess I would just say all of the above. It's been said already. It's, I think for me, it's really not about how it looks. It's about how it feels, and it's kind of almost overwhelming in its positivity and uplift and kind of invigoration. So yeah, it's all about the emotional response.
And do you think it's important that, you know, touching on the point that Emily and Kabir are making around that stewardship point, so how do we make sure that people feel connected to it and ownership? Do you think that's important?
Of course, I think that's part of what we're going to be talking about with sustainability, really, because unless people can feel attached, then a big element of the sustainability is missing, really, from the whole equation.
Yes. So, I mean, I think I asked this prior to this session around kind of how do we make spectacular horticulture sustainable? So, Ed, I don't know whether you want to say something about that.
Ed Ikin, yes.
Yes, I can. I'm going to have to do surnames, aren't I?
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah. So I suppose from my perspective, you know, biodiversity is an outcome of environment. You know, a well managed environment that's sort of healthy and perhaps that's sort of based around the long term. So there's something about really appraising what's there and, you know, understanding the current Grosvenor Square and what's strong about it, really perhaps getting under the ground as well and understanding what goes on under the soil too. And making sure that all of the decisions we make for the future of Grosvenor Square are about enriching the kind of current natural assets that are there. You know, there's already some very powerful natural forces which I want to co-opt in the first place, and you know, ensure that we build upon with any kind of future sort of aesthetic developments.
Fantastic. And Nigel, coming to you just before we move on, I guess it's, you know, what that link is, if you could touch a little bit on what that link is between planting, which I think we tend to get really excited about, and wildlife.
Well, yeah, the two go hand in hand. In fact, planting comes first, I would say, because the rest of the ecosystem and the web of life largely depends upon the green. So the two are completely indivisible, and we have to get the planting right for everything else to work.
Okay, fantastic. So it sounds as though, if I'm hearing correctly, we've got 4 components. So the idea about horticulture making us feel something, I think you all talked about that emotional response to going into something. I mean, and I guess the word spectacular in itself is quite emotive. The connection, that kind of interconnection between planting and biodiversity, and then looking at sustainability from a couple of different strands. One is you know, the thinking about the things that we might change within our public spaces and within Grosvenor Square that whether or not those changes would be sustainable, and then thinking about the educational role and stewardship part of that, because you know, how are we going to make this type of planting sustainable in the future? So we're going to be thinking about this from, as I said, from a city scale and from a Grosvenor Square scale. But first up, we're going to have Ed Ikin, who is going to be setting the scene for Wakehurst's role in monitoring the environmental impact of this project. Why is that an important thing to do? And the role that horticulture has to play. He's also going to touch a little bit on the existing condition of Grosvenor Square from a horticulture and biodiversity perspective, so that we have that in our minds. So over to you, Ed.
Okay, yeah, so I just wanted to talk, well, I sort of raised it just now, really, this sort of principle of biodiversity as an outcome of a well-managed environment. This is within kind of design settings. And there's a piece of research that we're going to do as part of Royal Botanic Gardens Kew to understand what's in Grosvenor Square right now. I'm very keen there's not a sort of a binary discussion between, you know, current square bad, new design good. It's much more nuanced than that. There's a whole range of natural assets within Grosvenor Square right now that are providing some really important services and benefits for the users of the square. So everything from the, you know, the temperature regulating capacity of the trees, their abilities to sort of take up pollution and make the air within the square immediately sort of cleaner, as well as the sort of the immediate well-being provision of that space. So really what I want to do now is talk about me and my sort of connection to plants, and then talk a little bit more about sort of the square. So I've worked in a few different places, both, as Ed Green was saying earlier, both sort of urban and rural. But for me, the kind of the thread that runs through all of them is kind of connections to plants. You know, there's something inherently abstract about a garden or a landscape which people can't appreciate, and you can see the sheer joy on my face at just being close to this plant, for example. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is where I work. This is Wakehurst. This is one of the species-rich grasslands which we manage. And for me, biodiversity brings environmental, ecological and psychological benefits. It brings multiple niches, visual richness, and actually, perhaps contrary to a lot of opinion, can often be the most robust and resilient option if you're kind of designing a managed landscape. It can be aesthetically appropriate and sort of beautiful, and should never just be seen as the sort of ticking the box in terms of a kind of sustainability target. I'd like to just show you a few sort of precedents which I think are really helpful. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is from Nantes in Western France, and it's a little bit of a crude pop-up, but for me, this is the instant insertion here of sort of visual and sort of natural diversity in what otherwise is a very kind of homogeneous sort of built environment. Not only are these natural forms very different to the buildings around them, but within the planters themselves, there's different types of plant. There's woody plants and non-woody plants, and those instantly bring different sort of niches and habitats for sort of fauna to occupy. And the next slide just is a sort of slightly more ordered take, but this is a sort of commercial and retail development just around Amsterdam South Station. And this is a very, very young planting, but here you can actually see some of the elements of a woodland, and this sort of desire to kind of create an analogue of the wild. So there's taller trees, there's understory trees, there's shrubby thickets, and there's a field layer of sort of herbaceous plants and grasses. And what this will create in the long term is a sort of a set of structural kind of diverse elements, and then sort of a biodiversity within it. So it'll be pleasing on the eye. There's variety here, but there's different habitats here forming for sort of the invertebrates and birds that will kind of want to sort of settle here in the long term. There's a nice focus for me on inhabitation as well. The next slide, please. So this is the Alara Whole Foods Garden up in King's Cross. This is a permacultural system. So this is about co-opting ecological function to create a service for us, namely food. So permaculture is about different layers. So you have something like Eleagnus, which is a nitrogen fixing plant, which kind of creates the upper story, a bit of shade and shelter for the plants below it, but also fixes nitrogen in the soil. So it's nutrients for the other plants within the system. So you've got this sense of complementarity, plants not directly competing with each other, but actually kind of working alongside each other, you know, in an echo of the wild. And this is true in the next picture as well, which is Hermannshof in southwest Germany. So this is a different type of service. This isn't food, this is a cultural service. This is beauty, which makes us feel happy. But this is actually a surprisingly authentic analogue of the wild. So this is a representation of a grassland system. You have what we call a functional layer, which is sort of clump forming grasses, and then an emergent layer coming through it. So it's various flowering plants. And this is a long time in the making. This is a sort of 15-year experiment. And what you have here is a lot of sort of stability. You have this the concept of complementarity again. So plants that are actually growing alongside each other and not directly competing. And you also have great beauty too. So what does this mean for Grosvenor Square? Next slide, please. So I think one of the fundamental things really is about people. We've talked a lot about people, but this sense that from the very beginning, the square should be somewhere that can be accessed, explored and inhabited, a place where people really want to spend time. That horticulture is a nice, rich, it's a process-driven way of making things. And I think the process gives people an opportunity to get engaged from the very beginning, to follow every twist and turn in this horticultural story, if you like. And I think, you know, when I talk about accessibility, there's physical accessibility, but there's intellectual accessibility as well. You shouldn't have to be an expert to enjoy these spaces. Everybody should feel welcome. Everybody should be able to share in the sort of the beauty that's on offer. There's also something about what we add. So like I was saying earlier, Q is going to research the baseline of Grosvenor Square. We're going to understand the role that those big plane trees are playing, for example. And perhaps it's not just about a tabula rasa, about scraping clean and starting again. It's about enrichment. It's about adding layers of structure and complexity and function that puts the trees that are there into a whole new design context, and really kind of starts to sort of evoke more perhaps of the structure of a woodland fringe or a woodland glade. And what shouldn't we do? Well, that's in the next slide. This is my only dip into dodgy clip art, I promise you. For me, the absolute thing to avoid is the sense of a false deadline. This, whilst there will inevitably be a ribbon cutting moment, please don't declare that this is the moment that the square is finished. The very, very best designs take time. They need to evolve. To rush, to bring everything together in a hurry might look amazing for the first couple of years, but has every chance of falling over in time. And I'd much rather we had something that looked extraordinary in a decade from now than look perfect within year one. So let's kind of have an evolutionary mentality about this. Can I have the next slide, please? And this is really best borne out with this example. So this is the Schulenburg Prairie. This is part of Morton Arboretum in Illinois. And this is a grassland restoration 50 years in the making. and the team that look after this will still say it's not finished. This is still every year gaining levels of diversity and complexity, and as a consequence supporting more and more pollinating insects and recycling beetles and mammals and birds, and this sense that perhaps we're never quite finished, we're always evolving this space is a crucial one to adopt. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, Ed, are you going to finish there? So
that's the end. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ed. So for some beautiful examples of planting, lots of things to think about, and we're going to move from that to some even more great examples from Nigel as part of the design team, as Ed explained earlier. So he'll be part of the team leading the redesign for Grosvenor Square. So we're going to be building on that idea of what horticulture has to play, bringing examples of planting to whet our appetites, and to think about why this approach is important from an environmental perspective. So thank you, Nigel. Over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Well, I should just say quickly about myself. I'm actually a scientist. I'm a botanist by training and an ecologist. And I spend my life in nature and making nature. But I'm not really going to talk about science at all now. We could have the next slide, please, because as we've been discussing up until now, it's about people. And I don't know about you, but certainly I just make it very, very personal. When I'm in the middle of a beautiful wildflower meadow or an incredible woodland in the spring full of bluebells and wildflowers, or even just seeing a hedgerow full of fruit in the autumn, I get really powerful feelings, and they're hugely positive, they're uplifting, they're joyful, they're invigorating, they're refreshing, and without any sort of religious connotations, I guess they're spiritual as well. You know, there's this feeling that you're part of something much bigger, and I don't believe I'm alone in that. I think this is almost a universal feeling that everybody is capable of. Next slide, please. Just an example of that, I was really lucky. I'm not showing off. I'm just using this as an example. I was really lucky this time last year in the spring of 2019 to be in California at the time of the super blue, when the deserts and whole landscapes changed color with the flowering of the deserts. Next slide, please. And this was kind of quite remote, but whole mountain ranges changing color, and people would drive for hours and hours and hours to see this. Hundreds of thousands of people every day going out from the cities to experience this natural spectacle. Next slide, please. You can see on the right here, just some people on trails through these mountains, looking at all these flowers. These are Californian poppies, annuals that come up in the springtime after winter rains. Next slide, please. But actually, when I was there, it was really interesting because people were not necessarily just sticking to the paths. There was this almost magnetic urge to get in there, to become part of nature. And I think this is something I want to emphasize. There's a huge difference between this uplifting natural experience and our usual experience of a park and garden. I think our normal experience of a park or a garden is very low energy, very passive. Very often we're standing on a lawn or a bit of hard surface and we're looking at planting and we're saying, oh yeah, that's nice, but it's low energy. When you're in the middle of something like this, you're not just an observer, you're a participant, you're an actor. It's high energy, you're surrounded by it, and it's not just what you see, it's what you smell, it's what you can feel and what you can hear. And I think, again, there's something about this type of environment that is very, very different to the normal horticultural experience. Next slide, please. In fact, it was people almost wanting to become part of it, almost swimming amongst the flowers. And of course, something like this draws a huge amount of negativity. People saying, oh, it's so shallow. People going to do this for an Instagram moment, and that's all that it's about. I see this sort of phenomenon as hugely exciting and hugely positive because it speaks to us about something primeval, about our need to experience this. And interestingly, as you can see in this image, most people going to experience this are young people. And there's this desperate urge to get more and more young people and new generations involved in horticulture and gardens and landscapes. And maybe this is part of the key to it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry, the one before that. I guess what I do in my own work is to try and recreate this sense of joy and of uplift in design places, in gardens and landscapes. And I guess the feeling I have is, why should it be something very special that you have to drive to for hours and hours, or only certain types of people who have the ability to go and see it can get there? Why can't it be something that's down the end of the street, that's in the local park, that's in the backyard, it's in the school, it's on the highway, it's everywhere, it's part of everyday life? Can we make this almost the default position? Next slide, please. And so this is what I'm really suggesting it's all about. It's about designed nature, and it's not about trying to copy nature, it's about doing designed versions of it. This is in the Olympic Park in London, and it's a wildflower meadow full of native plants, but you would never find these combinations in the countryside. It's designed to stimulate, it's designed to be extra colourful, it's designed to be long flowering, and it's a designed form of nature. Next slide, please. And I think having the opportunity to do this sort of thing in the Olympic Park was an amazing thing. It was really part of the design team, and got the chance to see the response of millions and millions and millions of people to this sort of designed form of nature. Next slide, please. But I think the most important thing is that really a lot of the projects and things I worked on are really in much more everyday environments, in housing estates, in local green spaces. And just like on that hillside in California, the response of people to an enhanced and pepped up form of nature is like no other response I've ever seen to any other type of garden or horticulture. Next slide, please. And that is because I think it reaches deep inside. And on the previous slide, I said really what we're doing is releasing joy and reaching deep inside people to release that sense of connection. And when you think about it, what a powerful thing, what an amazing thing it is we can do with gardens and landscapes to reach deep inside to people and to unlock extremely powerful emotions that may be buried deep, deep, deep. And like in that previous slide, I think they are childlike experiences that are in us all as adults as well as children. Next slide, please. Here in the Olympic Park, if you look closely on the left, there are people in amongst it having their photos taken, experiencing it. And I think this is just an amazing thing that we can do. Next slide, please. So this is all really about making what I would call an enhanced form of nature. And this is an extremely controversial thing to say, isn't it? Can we enhance nature? Can we do better than nature? Yeah, yes, we can. In cities, in design places, in gardens, we can do better because we can push it further. And because so many people in cities have such lack of contact with nature, I think we do need to push it further. We need to enhance it. We need to go one step beyond to really unlock these incredible, powerful emotions that people have. Next slide, please. And it is about creating immersive environments. It doesn't have to be all about all singing, all dancing color. It can be extremely calming, but it is this active being part of something rather than just looking at it from the sidelines. Next slide, please. So really just to finish off, I think it's all about creating high impact landscapes, gardens and places, but with low input, whether that's water or energy or even time. That's my definition of sustainable gardens and landscapes. Next slide, please. And then when we do that with these beautiful and incredibly engaging types of planting, we can do so many other things. We can cool down the overheated city, we can dry out the flooded city, we can clean up the polluted city, and we can all do this through the power of plants, and it can be beautiful as well. Next slide, please. And we can bring nature into places where you would never even imagine it was possible. And I think this, again, is an extremely powerful thing that we can do. Next slide, please. But I think for it to be effective in the era of climate change and species loss and extinctions and so on, we can't just play around at the edges. It has to be absolutely transformational. It has to be completely large scale, and it has to infiltrate into every aspect of our surroundings and our environments. Next slide, please. I think just to finish off with, and the next slide, the idea of future nature, and new nature, and artful ecology. And why do I say that we need a new look at nature, a new way of thinking about nature? Next slide, please. Well, we've been talking about greening cities and urban greening and nature in cities for decades and decades and decades. And in my opinion, it's still not mainstream. It's not the go-to solution. And maybe it's because of this. I think many people advocating urban greening would see this as maybe the list of priorities. We have to think about biodiversity. We have to think about ecology first. And we have to think about maybe climate change and all these things. And then maybe the visual appeal is at the very bottom. And many people I've spoken to in the ecological world say, well, it doesn't really matter what it looks like, so long as it works for biodiversity and so on. I think we have to completely change, next slide, and rearrange all of this. So up front, number one, high visual appeal. And then we talk about sustainability. And I think the simple maintenance and simplicity and the ability to do this successfully is crucial. And then, of course, we can think about all the other ecological aspects. So to me, personally speaking, this is the priority that we need to put if we want to mainstream these sorts of ideas. Next slide, please. So just to finish off with, really, I think the power of spectacular horticulture is to be sustainable, but to really touch people deep inside. And I think when you do that, you not only transform environments, you transform people. Thank you, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. Really gorgeous examples. And actually, my children have been admiring some of your planting over the weekend in the Olympic Park. They were completely mesmerized by it, and they're 4 and 18 months. So it is, I love those descriptions of the emotive power that planting can do to it. So we're going to move over to Emily now, who's going to give us some food for thought around engaging young people in understanding, caring for, and potentially taking a role in stewarding the future of planting in our cities. And not in a way that landowners renege their responsibility, but in a way that they can build better relationships and care for the environment. And I can also see some interesting questions coming up on the chat, so please do keep putting your questions in. But I think touching on that point of how do you create something that's really spectacular at the same time as inviting people to be near it, because people being near things can have its own potential for damage. So I think that's something that we'll pick up on in the panel discussion later. But thank you, Emily, and over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so we've been talking a little bit about people's role in these landscapes we've been talking about. And in this presentation, I just wanted to specifically focus on young people. My role at the London Wildlife Trust, I project manage our Keeping It Wild project. So that's a youth engagement programme that we launched in 2018. So I just wanted to talk about that really, and what we can learn and maybe take forward for Grosvenor Square as well. Just wanted to start a little bit about talking about what London Wildlife Trust does. We're one of the only charities dedicated to protecting London's wildlife, engaging local communities through outdoor learning, volunteering, and access to our nature reserves. So we manage 40 nature reserves across the capital. The one pictured here is Woodbury Wetlands, if any of you have been there, over in Manor House in North London. So our vision really is a city that's rich in biodiversity, where people from all different walks of life can treasure wildlife and have access to sort of natural green spaces really. Over our 35-year history, we've delivered a wide range of projects to engage London's communities in the protection and conservation of wildlife, and also sort of advising on sort of the management of green spaces such as parks and things as well. The Trust has a strong track record of engaging with primary schools, families and disadvantaged communities through specific projects and outdoor education programmes. Next slide, please. But we did recognise that there was a gap in our audience, and this is something I think that is reflected in the sector as a whole, and that is some of the difficulties with engaging those within the age group of 11 to 25, so beyond that primary school age. And furthermore, just sort of wanted to mention Stephen Moss's Natural Childhood Report on nature deficit disorder, which he published in 2012, which claimed that our nation's children are missing out on the pure joy of connection with the natural world, and as a result, as adults, they lack the understanding of the importance of nature to sort of human society. So with that in mind, we launched the Keeping It Wild project in 2018, which aimed to enthuse and enable young Londoners from a diverse range of backgrounds to get involved in protecting and promoting the capital's natural heritage. So nature that is often sort of hidden away, whether that's in gardens or parks or at nature reserves, and that's nature that's perhaps seen as irrelevant to young people living in and studying in the UK's busiest city. So we're particularly focused on working with young people who are, I'd say, sort of traditionally underrepresented within the environmental sector, so particularly those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, those that are living in sort of areas of socioeconomic deprivation, and those with sort of special education needs and disabilities as well. Could I have the next slide, please? Just want to touch on a little bit more about the project. So we wanted to encourage young people not only to gain an awareness of wildlife on their doorstep, but also to become actively involved in its protection and promotion by engaging them in an exciting programme of activities. Pictured here some of the young people that got involved in the programme over the last 2 years. We also do this by exploring film and media and other ways of communicating to young people about what they have learned and love about their local wildlife and green spaces. So it's ultimately only by sort of engaging young people who represent the enormous diversity of London will the natural heritage sector be able to reach a larger audience. And I think that's something that Kabir mentioned earlier about, you know, the next generation of custodians. We're working with 3 fantastic partners, the London Youth, umbrella organisation for just under 500 youth clubs across the capital, but also Headliners UK. So they use media and journalism as a way of giving young people a voice. So they have a really important role to play in this project of training young people up in sort of photography and filmmaking and journalistic skills to document their experiences on the programme, but also promoting that sort of peer-to-peer communication about wildlife and wild spaces as well. And then we also work with the John Muir Trust, who are, I guess, a more traditional conservation charity, to deliver the John Muir Award, one of their award schemes, which allows young people to kind of get an accreditation through their involvement in the programme. So through that, I mentioned we have a suite of different activities. So we have Wild Action Days, so one-off conservation taster days, so getting involved on site, one of our nature reserves, but also a skills development programme, a social action project, sort of mini grant scheme for youth clubs to access small pots of money to do green infrastructure and sort of greening their grey spaces, perhaps at their youth clubs. We also run a traineeship programme for young people between 16 and 25, and we have a young people's forum for a group of 15 young people to sort of steer the project, but also influence that kind of organisational change at the Trust, so that we're really embedding the learning from this project and sort of embedding youth engagement and involvement at the Trust as well. And we also, through this programme, wanted to work with youth workers as well. You know, nature reserves, parks and green spaces are a free resource waiting to be accessed by youth workers who sort of have the awareness and confidence to sort of building that awareness and confidence to access outdoor opportunities for the young people that they work with. So that's been essential. That sort of close collaboration with London Youth has been essential for being sort of able to access those different audiences and build capacity as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So what do young people want from London's green spaces? So through this project, we've been learning about what young people want from London's green spaces. Here I've outlined some of the thoughts and comments that we've captured throughout the duration of the project. And it would be fantastic to see some of these ideas considered as part of Grosvenor Square redesign. So some of the key points here, you know, echoing a lot about inclusivity and feeling a sense of ownership, a place that they can see people like themselves as well. Through some of our consultation for Keeping It Wild project, a lot of the comments were about sort of, oh, you know, those spaces aren't for me, or I'm not welcome there, or you know, don't see other young people there, so it can't be a space for me. So making sure you're creating a space which everyone feels welcome within as well, but also a place where they can see wildlife and experience nature. And they're really keen on that link between nature and their own mental health and well-being as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So how do we create spaces for both people and wildlife? So I guess generally speaking, a garden which is attractive to people is also attractive to birds, for example. So people appreciate screening bushes and diverse planting and things like that. A lot of what Ed and Nigel have talked about. And at its premise, we need to provide structural and habitat diversity, reflecting the sort of character of the locality. And maintaining a garden or a green space with multi-layered vegetation not only means that birds which feed at different levels can be accommodated, but also that the garden should support sort of a greater biomass of invertebrates, which will enhance the food base for birds as well. So I think it's really important to sort of think innovatively about incorporating green space into perhaps everyday objects and areas, as there's so much potential there as well. So for example, installing green roofs and bug hotels and bike shelters, bin stores, and creating ways to do rainwater harvesting and all that kind of stuff. Because that's also a way to then involve the community and part of that. They're seeing that in the sort of everyday spaces within these wider green spaces. And on this slide, you'll see some of our past young trainees who've been part of our traineeship programme. They're each with us for 12 weeks full-time, learning about how to manage green spaces for wildlife, how to raise awareness and get other people involved via community engagement work with our rangers and things on site. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just kind of want to touch on what this all means for Grosvenor Square, and so I want to start by mentioning the Wild West End initiative, which Grosvenor and the Trust are partners, and endeavouring to sort of green up the districts in Fitzrovia, Soho, for example, in West London, between Regent's Park and St James Park, along the sort of spine of Regent Street. In respect of Grosvenor Square, it can play a really important role in adding to that network, a nature recovery network for the West End, that provides sort of a stepping stone towards Hyde Park, which is sort of 500 metres away, I think, to the west. We've got to think about green spaces as a network, and not sort of isolated islands, I guess, and trying to connect these spaces as much as possible with incorporating green infrastructure and supporting the communities that live there. I believe there's also some housing estates hidden away around by Grosvenor Square. So I think North Row and Grosvenor just off Oxford Street. So there's potential there for sort of a very energetic group of gardeners as well. And the redesign is also potentially a fantastic opportunity to encourage stewardship of the space by young people as well. Something I touched on in a few slides ago was, they're also interested particularly in sort of developing new skills and thinking about their CV and training opportunities and things like that. And as the Keeping It Wild project and also the London National Park City initiative, which I'm sure Kabir will be talking about a little bit more, what they have shown is that there's a whole host of ways that we can encourage involvement and engagement with the capital's green spaces, whether that's through sort of practical conservation work on site, citizen science and training opportunities, but also just as a bit of captured learning, I guess, from the project, is if you can incorporate some of that digital skill set and journalism, creativity, photography, and trying to be a little bit innovative with that, with sort of promoting that involvement. And it's been a really useful hook for getting young people involved in the Keeping It Wild project as well. And just wanted to finish on, during this difficult time, the value of sort of being outdoors and reconnecting with nature has never really been more apparent. I think a lot of people are sort of waking up to that and seeing that, nature and their local green spaces and parks have just been essential to their own well-being as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I think you're absolutely right there. It's something that's we're all more acutely aware of. And I think it's also really important that we inspire a future generation to be excited and interested in planting in outdoor spaces so that they're advocates for it. And whether that means about being really hands-on or just having the awareness. So our next speaker is going to link those two things brilliantly together, whilst also making me think about all the stuff I wasn't doing at the age of 15. So Kabir provides that lovely link, as I just said, about engaging young people with the outdoors. And he's going to be talking about bringing birds to London and specifically to Grosvenor Square. But I know that he's also really interested in wildlife in general. And I've certainly been more aware of birds in my neighbourhood over the last few weeks. And it's something that I think we all would like to sustain. So thank you, Kabir, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'm Kabir. I'm a young conservationist and wildlife writer. I'm really, really passionate about London's biodiversity. Next slide, please. So I wear a number of hats. So I'm a London National Park City champion, so I help to spread awareness and encourage people to think of the London National Park City idea, the idea that London is a very green city and everyone plays their part in it. I'm also an RSPB youth councillor, so I represent the views of the RSPB's youth membership. And also I am a Cameron Bespolka Trust ambassador. The Cameron Bespolka Trust is an organisation which gets children outside and into nature, particularly, as Emily said, from the ages from 11 to 25, an age group which has lost a lot of connection with nature. Next slide, please. So today I'll be talking to you mainly about how Grosvenor Square can attract birds. So in February last year, I created Nature Reserves of London. It's an interactive map which you can find on my blog. It shows all the nature reserves and designated wildlife sites in the capital. And I'm showing you here the city of Westminster as it appears on the map. There are 24 publicly accessible designated wildlife sites in the borough, and that just shows how biodiverse central London alone really is. Places such as the Royal Park, so Regent's Park, St James's Park, and Hyde Park are all designated wildlife sites. And there are a few private wildlife sites as well. So that could be some those include some private gardens within the borough. So circled here is Grosvenor Square. So once that fine balance of harmonious coexistence between people and wildlife is established, it must be connected. It must be connected to the other wildlife sites and green spaces in the borough. for birds to use as a wildlife corridor and thrive in every space, they all need to be connected together to form that biodiverse corridor, which should really be a flagship design for wildlife corridors in urban areas. That network, that connection is vital. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to give you a few examples of parks and green spaces doing just this, not necessarily in Westminster, but in central London. This is probably my favourite community garden in the whole of London. It's run by a group of very dedicated volunteers. I believe they're with us here today in the City of London. Next slide, please. This is the Barbican Wildlife Garden. It's so beautiful. It's got so much biodiversity. It's got a bird hide, spectacular wildflower meadows too, which I'll talk about shortly, and also a small woodland area benefiting birds. The sparrow population in the city has recovered probably from the Barbican Wildlife Garden alone. It has nest boxes for different species, including blue tits and goldfinches, and it's probably the common species which Grosvenor Square must benefit first, because after that, we're onto something if we attract rarer species as a result. The ponds offer a great water source for all species and a home for frogs too. Next slide, please. Now on to St John's Wood Church Gardens. It's a local nature reserve in the City of Westminster, opposite Lord's Cricket Ground. Next slide, please. It doesn't hang bird feeders or put up nest boxes, but it manages its existing grassland cemetery habitat. They've planted a few berry bushes here and there, which attract blackbirds, redwings, and other thrushes. And as well as managing a small part of the gardens, a tiny part of the gardens is actually the local nature reserve. It's managed for wildlife, but the rest is open recreational space like any other Westminster park. So that fine balance of harmonious coexistence has already been achieved in the borough. And I think Grosvenor Square can take some inspiration from the gardens. And even though only a very small space is designed to attract wildlife, and all the plants there specifically are used to attract wildlife there, they've attracted tree creepers. This one was taken in Rutland in 2015 at the Bird Fair, a gathering for bird watchers occurring every year. And you can see it, that this is a very unusual looking bird, but they thrive in the gardens. I've been lucky enough to see one. And also we have the blackbird on the right, which is a common visitor to the garden, as well as squirrels, which benefit from the plants around as well. So as you can see, they don't use bird feeders or nest boxes. They manage their existing habitat. And I think Grosvenor Square should be doing a bit of both in order to be successful as a key wildlife site in Westminster and in the locality of Grosvenor Square. Now I'd like to talk to you about methods we can use to attract a variety of species to the square. But firstly, as an ambassador for a youth charity, it shouldn't just be those who work here that are benefited from the square. I think children in local schools should immerse themselves in this new opportunity for biodiversity and people to connect together and interact with each other, as they are the future custodians of the world. It's vital that they should learn from Grosvenor Square, and it should be a source of a place which fuels their passion and curiosity for nature, and they can continue that into their later lives. So, going anti-clockwise, we have ponds, which are a great source of water for birds, and also attract a variety of different species like frogs and newts, and pollinators too, depending on what plants are planted around the ponds. We have a reedbed habitat. Now, I know this may sound a bit outlandish or ludicrous, but it can be done. It has been done in other London parks, and as a result, it has attracted reed warblers and Chetty's warblers. I'm sure that's the case on many London Wildlife Trust nature reserves. And we have teasels as well, which are a great source of food for goldfinches in particular. Now, at the very bottom of the screen, you can see a wildflower meadow. That's in the Barbican Wildlife Garden. As you can see, it looks magnificent. So over a few years, just adding different types of wildflowers, benefiting birds, bats, and bees and butterflies too. All these different pollinators, which are all connected together. It'll really be a huge achievement for Grosvenor Square there. And we have log piles as well, which attract and are a great home for insects, which birds can feed on. And hopefully one day, if we put a log pile out in Grosvenor Square, we'll have a thriving population of black redstart. I know they benefit from Westminster's green infrastructure created by Wild West End. So perhaps we can continue that in the square. For added biodiversity, we can add hedgerows too. And who knows, one day we'll get a nightingale singing in Grosvenor Square. How wonderful would that be? And we can also include a few berry bushes too, because in winter, they are enjoyed by thrushes, redwing and fieldfare, which migrate from Scandinavia. And they will really depend heavily on this essential food source. Next slide, please. But besides plants, bird feeders and nest boxes will be needed to improve species numbers in Grosvenor Square. Again, going anti-clockwise, woodcrete nest boxes are very durable, and they can also attract a number of species, a lot of species actually. And we can also have species-specific nest boxes as well. So those for tawny owls, kestrels, peregrines, I know they do breed in the borough. So it'd be great for a step forward into being part of that network of biodiverse sites in Westminster. It would be great to put out some of these species-specific nest boxes so that wildlife benefits in every place. And finally, these bird feeders pictured here should be protected because invasive species like squirrels and ringneck parakeets are very common in the borough, etc., in central London as a whole. And with protection, they will give the smaller birds a chance and a safe refuge to feed and thrive. Below, there's a list of birds which might benefit from Grosvenor Square as a whole. But it's not limited to this list. The possibilities are endless. So let's make Grosvenor Square a place for people and birds to thrive together. Thank you.
Thank you, Kabir. So much wonderful knowledge there. It's amazing. Ed is going to join us now, Ed Green. So we're going to have two Eds just for additional confusion. So Ed Green is going to join us now for our panel discussion. I've got some of the questions that audience, thank you, you have been sending in. If you have others, please do send them in and I will put them to the panel. But I'm going to start by asking the panel about what seems to be this pull between creating the ambition for creating this immersive experience for people versus how you do that in a space like Grosvenor Square where there are lots of different audiences and there are lots of different users. So how do you make sure it can be immersive but at the same time be accessible to a large range of people? So Nigel, I'm going to come to you first for that.
Thank you. Well, I think part of the problem is seeing these as two different things and being mutually exclusive. So I think the starting point has to be that all of these things can be done. And I guess one of the big things that have come out of all of these talks is about just thinking differently about things and not being kind of tied with how things have been done in the past. But it's a great chance to start again. So I think the naturalistic, ecological, horticultural experience is almost like the matrix. It's the background within which all of these other things fit. And I think for me, one of the ways to see this is that should almost, the planting in the green should almost be the first consideration. And then you kind of work out how everything else can fit into that. So often on landscape and garden schemes, everything else is worked out first. And then you kind of squeeze the planting and the ecology and the green bits in around all of that. Well, what a great thing to do the opposite and to be landscape and ecology and biodiversity and kind of plant-led first and foremost.
Ed Ikin, I can see you nodding. I don't know whether you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I think, you know, exploring what Grosvenor Square can become, it's so tempting in a very built space to think, well, do we need to add architecture in here? Does this place need a building to almost hold the whole thing together? And I think it's a really strong and brave decision to say, well, actually, no, this has to be green driven. You know, the space, well, people sort of say it's a bit bigger than a garden. It's not quite as big as a park. You really can pull off one very strong horticultural effect well in this space, and to make use of that kind of full 30,000 square meters. And it's then just thinking about the sort of the people. You know, we've constantly talked about the kind of relationship between buildings design and a community of people that will work with it. We'll put them in the middle of the design, see how people use the space now, think about some of the very natural ways that people will want to orientate around those spaces, think as much about where the paths will go, where they won't naturally trample through the plantings.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess that's part of the reason why we're doing this series of talks and we're doing some local conversations, is to specifically try to draw out that kind of insight. So Emily, there's one that I'm going to start off with you on, which is around whether or not we think that some of the reasons why there might be less citizen involvement beyond kind of consultation processes is because that isn't set out at the beginning. So whether you think there's any learning in us trying to set that out from early days in order to create and foster that stewardship.
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked on a number of different community development projects that have sort of been centered around creating new spaces and things. And I definitely say, you know, having that involvement from the start and getting people to feed into to designs, but also what Ed was saying, you know, getting people in those spaces and, you know, letting them sort of telling us how they sort of feel when they're in those spaces, and I think ownership, fostering a sense of sort of ownership over those spaces comes from sort of having that involvement right from the start, and just thinking about the Keeping It Wild project. We had a development phase where we did a lot of consultation with young people, and that we came up with our activity plan purely through all of the suggestions coming through from those young people about what they wanted to get involved in, and so I think that's absolutely essential to have people involved from the very start.
And then Kabir, I'm wondering whether you can give us a really tangible example of something, like obviously you're really motivated and involved in things. Are there any tangible examples of how you are involved in being like part of that stewardship role of an open space?
Well, I volunteer with the Harrow Nature Conservation Forum, so they manage all the different designated wildlife sites and other green spaces as well in the London Borough of Harrow. And they have this project called Harrow Nature Heroes, which is encouraging young people in Harrow to take ownership of different green spaces and feel proud of all this biodiversity around in their local areas, and try and help them to, I think it's a points-based system. So you earn different points for different activities. For example, it could be volunteering or a certain type of habitat management. I think they give a real sense of, there's a real sense of belonging, that everyone has a common goal to protect and restore habitats for the future. And also I am involved in volunteering at Westbury Banks Nature Reserve. It's a community-run nature reserve. It's almost like a little green corridor in Knoll Park, which is an area of wood green. And I can see they're encouraging the local children, the primary school children, to make signs outside for Westbury Banks, and again, habitat management. And I think that's, for primary school children especially, that's one of their first step into feeling that sense of belonging, that sense that they're going to be the custodian of this natural world, and that their passion and curiosity will result in a much better future of these wild spaces.
Fantastic. So there's an interesting question around, I guess a lot of the examples that we've shown have been more on the wild side than on the manicured side. So Nigel, there's a question which I'm going to come to you with, which is, can beautiful wild plantings look good all year round?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the things we've seen in the other talks, which show winter and show seed heads and show birds feeding on teasels and so on. The beauty is not just in flowers or just in green. There can be beauty in the winter. In fact, I think things could be more beautiful in the winter sometimes. And I think we can work in a lot of evergreen as well as deciduous things. But I think the bigger point for me is that we again need to get away from the idea that there's a separation between a garden and the nature area, and that the biodiversity has to happen in the nature area. I think, in the spirit of new thinking, well, that's kind of old thinking. And we need to think much more positive in the future, that we can make the whole of a site to be the nature and biodiversity place, as well as the place for people. And we don't need to separate out and partition these things at all. But it is crucial, it looks good, and it looks good year round. And that's something that has to be a real top priority.
Yeah. Ed Green, you're gonna, I bet you could have played bingo on what would have been the top question that's going to come to you, which is, this all sounds lovely, but how do we know there's going to be sufficient funds to sustain it? So you do something beautiful, and how do we know that it's going to be sustained?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's obviously a really important point. And, when Grosvenor took about management of the square a few years ago, I think we were very aware that we were taking on, significant costs that we're, paying every year at the moment. And if we're going to enhance the square in the ways that we're talking about, and we're inspired by, then that cost is only going to go up. I think it's something that we're exploring at the moment, and we're trying to work out exactly what is the right management tool at the moment. We started working with some fantastic landscape management experts. Also started talking to some experts in the world of kind of governance and how we set up the right structures for governance, so that in the future we have the community not just kind of on the outside consulting, but really on the inside kind of advising and being really part of the decision making process of the square in the future. It's a new space for us, and one that we're really lucky to be advised by some great people, but absolutely we're committed to making sure this is successful into the long term.
Yeah, I think we might have to just keep having you say that, record it on loop, just play it back, because I think that's people's concern, isn't it? It's that if you move beyond something that it will over time just revert back. Go on, Ed, Ikin.
Yeah, just to say, I think there's sometimes a misconception that adding something new or different will increase maintenance. And actually, with the type of designs that Nigel creates and that we develop at Wakehurst, it's actually just shifts the maintenance from one form to another. And perhaps, you're not mowing every day or sort of edging or weeding, but you're actually starting to just select advantages for certain species so they establish. So the overall labour load may be the same, but it just goes in different directions.
Fantastic. Actually, that allows me to segue into another question around whether there are plans around, I'm going to read exactly this, Britain's endangered list of plantings and wildlife, whether there's a plan to introduce some of those in terms of supporting biodiversity. I've read that question. I don't know if that list exists.
Who are you asking?
I'm going to ask Nigel. He looks most uncomfortable to receive the question. So
I think Kabir made a really, really good point, and it's something I really try and emphasize, but sometimes it gets lost, that there's so much focus on the rare and trying to encourage really rare things, but things are often rare because they're really specialized, and in some ways we need to encourage the common and almost the recognizable things that people that are familiar with, and then, as Kabir said, you start to build upon that, and everything is a bonus. So I think that's kind of a good starting point, that we really make it a thriving place for, not the commonplace, but for kind of generalists in a way. And then, where possible, you can start to work in habitats and features to encourage endangered or, real target species. But I think, anything you can do on that is kind of over and above making a great site for wildlife in general.
So Kabir, do you think that's something that you see people do, get fixated on kind of special or rare?
Yes, quite often, to be honest. Separately, there's this whole concept of twitching, which is where birders, so bird watchers, go out hundreds of miles, or sometimes it just depends where the bird is. And it's an extremely rare bird, and they only go and see rare birds. I think that can be quite stressful because it's a hit and miss hobby. But with normal birding, you take your time and you appreciate the beauty in every species, and you just enjoy nature at the same time, your surroundings, the habitats you're surrounded by, and you really appreciate it. So I think in Grosvenor Square, since it's about encouraging everyone, people of all ages, to come and get involved and visit the square and play their part in creating its future. I think it's the common species especially that will need to benefit as a result, because with common species, that's what people see on their doorstep. And I think it's only when we teach people the knowledge, we give people the knowledge to learn about these different species, and that they'll actually appreciate and have the will and the passion to protect them. And it all starts with the common species, those they see in their local area, because they wouldn't necessarily see a rare species that only comes up from time to time. So I think we'd be really onto something if we encourage people to appreciate and focus specifically on the common species first. And then when the rare species come, that's, again, as Nigel was saying, that's almost like a bonus of our achievements here.
I mean, I think there's something interesting here, Ed, Ikin, I'm going to come to you first on this, around, I think each one of these conversations we've had, the subject has come up around openness, and that actually a quality that Grosvenor Square has at the moment is a sense of openness, and you have this central space. And balancing that somehow with like some of the words that we've been talking about here, like immersive and kind of feeling surrounded, and that creates a sense that perhaps we're talking about something that's full. And I don't know whether you can say something about that balance between creating something that's immersive but also acknowledging that there's a need for space.
Yeah, and there will always be some trade-offs, I think, and there's something about the seasonal variations as well, that perhaps in the very height of summer, when the vegetation is tall, there'll be more kind of intimate or secluded spaces through the square, and then it's very much about the design, perhaps creating good places to sit, whereas in the winter, you know, things do die down and it becomes more open, and it's about the broader sort of composition. But yeah, this idea of plants up around your head, this sort of return to childhood and running through a meadow, it would be lovely if we can evoke a degree of that. And I know there's always concerns in public spaces about, you know, does that kind of support antisocial behaviour and what on earth is going on in the midst of those tall plants? But I really hope we can have a sense of that, because those are the moments where you start to lose yourself and you sort of suddenly can't see the city around you.
Nigel, would you agree?
Absolutely. It's what I was trying to get across is that childhood feelings in adults, and I think that is the power of what can be done in landscapes, and it's kind of an emotional liberation, and I think it's a hugely powerful thing that we can do. And there is a trade-off between too much seclusion and personal safety and so on. I think Ed's quite right there, so that really has to be looked at carefully.
Okay, fantastic. Emily, so a lot of the questions that seem to relate to your stuff around, you know, I guess thinking about how realistic it is to ask for volumes of time. So I wonder whether you could say a little something about the different, I guess it's not about saying, well, we 100% hand over responsibility of this to these volunteers. It's somehow from what I heard of what you were saying, the stewardship was so much more than about just the practical hands-on stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real danger that people feel overwhelmed. I think when they sort of get involved with some of the management of different green spaces and parks and things like that. So it's balancing that need of you know, people taking responsibility and being able to rely on people to support with the, you know, sustainability of the site, but also looking at what do those people want to be getting out of it as well. You know, I mentioned the young people we work with look at ways in which they can learn new skills and build their CV, and that's really important to them. So promoting some of those benefits beyond just kind of getting involved, really. How can we put together a package of different things that will sort of hook people, and for it not to be too daunting and overwhelming a responsibility as well. So looking at what they really want to get out of the opportunity. I think that echoes, you know, a lot of different volunteering opportunities as well as it's a two-way street.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask one more question in the panel format, and then we're going to draw it to a close. But Nigel, we've had a few questions about water. So whether or not, you know, what we're, you know, some of the things that you've been describing, what the role of water is, and whether you're just designing something that is water intensive, and yeah, what that means in terms of sustainability.
So I think the whole idea about sustainability and high impact, low input is to minimize the requirement for a lot of water or irrigation. So that's kind of the starting point. It's not saying that there wouldn't be a need for any, because obviously you want things to still stay healthy in extreme times and to get established. But the whole starting point really will be that this would not be a landscape that's dependent, like a lot of London landscapes are, on irrigation systems that are constantly pumping water in to keep everything fresh and green. I think that does mean that when you start to think about a more sustainable future, things might look a little bit different to traditional, intensively irrigated and maintained landscapes. And I think that's part of the journey, and some of the things that Emily's been talking about. I think it's also about bringing people along on that journey for something which might look different in the future compared to what we might be used to in the past. But yeah, water use and water conservation is really one of the core principles here.
Fantastic. So again, I think water is something that comes up time and time again in these conversations, so I'm sure we will touch on it again. So I'm going to ask each of you to give me a little snippet of what you think the key lesson from today would be for Grosvenor Square. So Kabir, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, I think it should be a place where all ages can benefit from, and with the right blend of perhaps habitats, accessibilities, the right amount of management. For example, perhaps manicuring some places for people, letting other spaces grow wild, and just gathering everybody's amazing ideas and putting them into one, blending them together. And also to attract the common species first, and encourage and educate people in the local area and visitors as well to learn to love the common species on their very doorstep, and count the rarer species as a sort of bonus, as an extra, an achievement of our work.
Fantastic. Emily?
Yeah, I think just to kind of sum up a lot of the points about, you know, not seeing, you know, horticulture and people as kind of separate things, really. We've talked about both areas, I think, in the same level of detail, really, and also thinking about Grosvenor Square as one piece, I guess, in a larger sort of interconnected network of habitats and spaces across London as well, and its role in I guess this nature recovery network as well. So yeah, those are my points.
Thank you. Ed, Ikin?
I think what really strikes me is the scale of ambition here. You know, the chance to create something that will be spectacular horticulturally, but has the potential to sustain a whole new kind of ecosystem of wildlife around it, but also something that's going to be built from the bottom up with a group of users too. So this for me is going to be one of the more extraordinary green spaces in London, in Britain, perhaps globally, for all of those kind of three reasons, really.
And Nigel.
Yeah, I should say, because I am sort of involved, I should say views my own when I say this. I think the point for me is that we can have beauty and biodiversity, that, you know, we can be completely integrated with all of these things. And I think finally I would say that, you know, there are planting and green solutions for many things that we should always look at over a constructed and more kind of hardscape first approach. So those are two thoughts from me.
Fantastic. So audience as well, if you have your key lesson that you think you take away from today for Grosvenor Square, if you can put that in the chat, that would be amazing. Ed Green, are you going to do 1 point?
Yes, I am going to do 1 point. And I think it was, you know, I guess I've thought a lot about this from the people perspective. You know, I work in Mayfair, and my experience of Grosvenor Square is, and, you know, I think a lot of that talk about, you know, enhancing the beauty of the experience of people. And I guess it's really struck home to me today that we have an opportunity to go far beyond that and create habitats for more creatures and for wildlife. And I guess I've kind of spoken about it before, but I guess, yeah, today it's really hit home what an exciting opportunity that is to make a new ecosystem.
Fantastic. It is very exciting. I think there's lots of things to balance, and there are lots of comments and ideas that have come in. So thank you so much to the audience for participating. We will be going through all of those afterwards. And sorry, there's not enough time for me to put all of your questions to the panel. But yeah, up here you can see there's the Grosvenor Square website, which you go on and find out more about the project. And there's a Have Your Say tab there. It'd be great if people can put their feedback in there. You can also follow us on Instagram or Twitter. And get involved in the conversation. And just as we close, I want to promote a couple of upcoming events. So if you are local to Mayfair and to Grosvenor Square and you would like to have the opportunity to talk to Nigel in a bit more detail, we've got 2 events coming up, one on Saturday and one on Tuesday next week, where yes, it'll be more of a kind of intimate conversation with Nigel and some of the team from Tonkin Loo. Who wouldn't want to have a more detailed chat with Nigel about planting? And then the next big topic talk like this that we've got coming up is on the 9th of June. So if I can have the next slide. Perfect. It's about healthy places. This is us thinking around the activities and infrastructure that we need to have within Grosvenor Square to support the types of place that we want it to be, the activities and that we would like to go on there. So that is on the 9th of June, same time as this. So you can sign up to get involved in that. Any other questions, comments, email us, visit the website, Twitter, Instagram. And it just leaves me to say thank you so much for participating. Thank you so much to the panelists. Ed, audience, it's been really fantastic, and I hope that you'll be able to join us at one of our upcoming events over the next month or so. Ed Green, do you want to say any final words?
No, just a big thank you to everyone and to all our panelists. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion today. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.